snow. A woman's boot sinks into it, ankle deep, then still. She does not move. Beyond her, a wooden platform. Beyond the platform, a town of 12 buildings. Beyond the town, a mountain that has no bottom to its silence. The wagon behind her is already gone. She has 2 silver coins in her pocket and a name on a folded paper. The name belongs to a man she has never met. The man she has never met is waiting for her somewhere at the edge of this snow. Except 3 shadows separate themselves from the tree line. Not 1, 3. Broad, bearded, motionless. The tallest lifts his head and his eyes find her across the whiteness, and something in his jaw sets the way a door sets before it is locked from the inside. Her gloved hand tightens on the folded paper. She has come 3,000 miles to marry the wrong dead man, and the mountain behind them all begins to whisper. Before the stagecoach ever stopped moving, before the snow began to fall on that last Tuesday of November, there was a girl in Philadelphia with 2 silver coins in her reticule and a decision to make. And the decision was this: she could stay in a house where an old man had begun to look at her the way men look at things they intend to own, or she could answer an advertisement in the back pages of a Chicago newspaper and travel 3,000 miles into a mountain territory to marry a stranger she had never met. She chose the mountain. She chose the stranger. She did not know when she chose that the stranger was already dead. The stagecoach stopped moving at 4 in the afternoon on the last Tuesday of November, and Elspeth Fairweather woke up to a silence so complete she thought she had died. She hadn't. She had simply arrived. The driver banged twice on the roof, the way he had done at every stop between Philadelphia and Montana territory, and Elspeth pressed her palm flat against the frost on the window and looked out at the place her whole life was supposed to begin. Snow. Not the polite Philadelphia kind that dusted the cobblestones and made the lamplighters look important. This snow was different. This snow meant business. It came down in fat, deliberate flakes that seemed to know exactly where they were going, and it had already covered the ground so completely that Elspeth could not tell where the road ended and the wilderness began. The town was called Ironwood Falls. She knew the name. She had written it on envelopes. She had studied it on the crumpled advertisement in her reticule, the one she had folded and unfolded so many times. The crease had begun to tear, but knowing a name and standing inside one were 2 entirely different things, and Elspeth Fairweather was standing inside one now. Her breath fogged the glass. Her fingers were numb inside her gloves. She had eaten 1 piece of hardtack and half an apple in the last 20 hours, and her hair, which had been arranged in a careful chignon by a kind old woman in St. Louis, had come loose in wisps around her face. She looked, she suspected, exactly like what she was, a 22-year-old woman who had run out of options in Philadelphia and traded her last $40 for a stranger's name in a mining town 3 days past the middle of nowhere. The driver climbed down. She heard his boots crunch through the fresh snow, heard him mutter something to the horses, heard him fumble with the trunk latch at the back of the coach. She smoothed her navy blue traveling dress across her lap, the one her employer's wife had thrown at her 3 weeks ago with a curt instruction to make herself decent in it. The word had stung then. It stung now. But the dress was warm and the wool was good, and Elspeth had learned a long time ago that pride was a thing you could not eat, so she had put the dress on and thanked the woman and left the Van Wyck household forever. She checked her cameo brooch. straight. She checked her gloves, intact. She checked her reticule for the 12th time since Cheyenne, and the folded advertisement was still there, along with 2 silver coins and a lock of her mother's hair that she carried the way other women carried Bibles. The door opened. Cold rushed in like it had been waiting. The driver's beard was white with frost, and he squinted in at her with the kind of face a man makes when he suspects he is delivering a lamb to a wolf's den. He asked quietly whether she was certain this was her stop. She was not certain. She had not been certain about anything in 9 days, but she nodded because certainty and necessity were also 2 different things, and she stepped down onto the wooden platform that passed for a station in Ironwood Falls, Montana Territory, on the last Tuesday of November 1884. Her boots sank 2 inches. The wind bit through her wool coat like it had a personal grievance against her, and there, standing in a loose half-circle at the edge of the platform, waiting the way men wait when they are trying not to look like they are waiting, stood 3 of the largest men Elspeth Fairweather had ever seen in her life. She stopped breathing, not from fear, from arithmetic, because her letter, her contract, the folded and refolded advertisement in her reticule had promised her 1 man, 1 name, 1 future, Callum Harrogate. And there were 3 enormous bearded, weather-cured men in shearling coats and fur hats, standing motionless in the falling snow, watching her the way wolves might watch a lamb that had wandered too far from the flock. Except the one in the middle wasn't watching her like a wolf. He was watching her like a man who had just seen something he could not explain and could not fix and could not send back. I was the tallest, broad through the shoulders, older than the others by 5 or 6 years at least, with a jaw like a granite ledge and eyes so pale they looked almost silver against his weather-darkened skin. His beard was dark brown, threaded through with 2 streaks of iron gray at the chin. He wore his hat low against the snow. His left hand was tucked into his coat pocket in a way that did not look casual. The one on his right was even bigger, somehow. Elspeth had not thought that was mathematically possible, but there he was, a grizzly bear of a man with a beard so dense it looked like a forest had grown on his face while he wasn't paying attention. His eyes were dark and flat and completely unreadable, and he was already looking past her at the trunk the driver was hauling down from the roof. The one on the left was the youngest, handsomest in a rougher way, chestnut brown hair falling almost to his shoulders under his hat, eyes the color of gray river water, a mouth that looked like it had in a different life known how to smile. He was the one who broke the silence. She'd be Miss Fairweather. His voice was warmer than she expected. Elspeth nodded because her throat had gone completely dry between the 2nd and 3rd step off the platform. He touched the brim of his hat, and the snow slid off in a small avalanche, and he introduced himself as Finnegan Harrogate. Finn. He gestured to the tall one with the hidden hand and named him Jedediah. Jed. He tilted his head at the grizzly. Ezra. Ezra did not tip his hat. Ezra did not say anything. Ezra continued to stare at the trunk as though it had personally offended him. Elspeth swallowed. She had rehearsed this moment for 9 days. She had practiced her curtsy against the swaying of the coach until she could do it without falling. She had practiced her greeting until the words felt smooth in her mouth. She had planned to say, "Mr. Harrogate, I am honored to meet you at last, and I look forward to the life we will build together." She said none of it. Instead, she asked which one of them was Callum. The silence that followed was not the silence of men who had missed a question. It was the silence of men who had heard it exactly and did not want to answer. Finn's shoulders dropped half an inch. Ezra's eyes at last came off the trunk and settled on her face, and there was nothing in them she could read. And the tall one, the one with the hidden hand, took one long, slow breath, and then he told her very quietly that Callum had been under 3 feet of frozen ground since May. The world stopped. It did not fade. It did not swim. It did not do any of the theatrical things Elspeth had read about in novels. It simply stopped the way a clock stops when a spring breaks, and Elspeth Fairweather stood in the snow at the edge of a platform in Ironwood Falls, Montana territory, and understood with a clarity she had not felt since her mother died that she was in every direction she could imagine entirely alone. She could not speak. Speaking would have required air, and air was at that particular moment unavailable. Jed watched her. He did not step forward. He did not reach for her. He did not, thank God, offer her sympathy, because sympathy at that moment would have shattered her into pieces too small to gather. He simply watched her and let her have the 30 seconds she needed. Behind her, the driver cleared his throat and reminded her apologetically that he had a schedule. He offered to carry her trunk over to the boarding house across the street. Widow Marchand's, he said, $1.50 a night. Elspeth had 2 silver coins. She had 2 silver coins and a lock of her mother's hair and 44 cents in copper in the bottom of her reticule, and she had a return coach fare that did not exist because she had spent the last of the money to get here. She turned back to the 3 brothers. Jed had not moved. Neither had Ezra. Neither had Finn. The 3 of them stood in the snow like men who had been carved out of the mountain behind them, and Elspeth understood in that moment that her entire future depended on the next sentence she chose. She straightened her shoulders. She lifted her chin. She did what her mother had taught her to do the day her father died, when Elspeth was 8 years old, when the debt collectors had come to the door and the priest had not. She kept her voice level, and she informed Mr. Harrogate that since her intended husband was no longer available, and since she had exactly 2 silver dollars in her possession, and since she could not return to Philadelphia this evening, she needed to know which one of them was going to marry her instead. Or, she added, whether she was expected to sleep in the barn. The wind pulled a strand of honey blonde hair loose from her chignon and laid it across her cheek. She did not push it back. Finn's mouth fell open. Ezra made a sound like a horse being kicked, and Jed Harrogate, the tall one with the hidden hand and the granite jaw, closed his eyes for exactly 2 seconds, the way a man closes his eyes when he has been asked a question he cannot possibly answer honestly. When he opened them, he was looking at her differently, not softly, not with pity, with something closer to recognition, the way a man looks at another traveler who has come a long way in bad weather and has not yet been offered a chair. "Get in the wagon, Miss Fairweather." That was all he said. He turned, he walked. He did not look back to see if she followed. Ezra swung her trunk up onto his shoulder like it weighed nothing, which, considering it contained everything Elspeth owned in the world, felt like a small and terrible commentary on her life. He carried it to the wagon and dropped it into the bed with a thud that Elspeth felt through her boots. Finn offered her his arm. She took it. Her legs, she discovered, were shaking, and she was not entirely sure they were going to carry her the 12 steps to the wagon. But Finn's arm was steady, and Finn did not comment when she gripped it harder than a lady should have. He handed her up onto the bench. Jed was already there, reins in his good hand. Ezra climbed into the back with the trunk. Finn swung up on the other side of Elspeth so that she was seated, snow settling on her lap between the oldest and the youngest Harrogate, with the middle one sitting behind her like a wall of quiet judgment. Jed clicked his tongue. The horses moved, and Elspeth Fairweather rode out of Ironwood Falls, Montana territory, headed 12 miles up into a mountain called Whisper Ridge on the last Tuesday of November, 1884, with her wedding dress still folded at the bottom of her trunk and no wedding waiting at the end of the road. She did not cry. She had promised herself in Cheyenne that she would not cry until she was inside a room with a door she could lock. The road climbed, the snow deepened, the trees closed in on either side, dark and enormous and older than any city she had ever seen, and after a while the silence of the wagon and the huff of the horses and the muffled sound of hooves on new snow settled into something almost like peace. Almost. She stole a glance sideways. Jed's face in profile was harder than it had been on the platform. His jaw was set. His right hand, the one on the reins, was capable and strong, and Elspeth realized with a small internal jolt that she had not yet seen his left hand at all. He caught her looking. He did not turn his head, but she felt him notice, and she felt her own face heat, and she looked down at her lap and told herself very firmly that she was being ridiculous because she had bigger problems than one man's hidden hand, and she had them in every direction. Finn broke the silence to ask whether she was warm enough. She told him she was managing. She was not. She was freezing. But she had made a decision 3 days ago somewhere in Nebraska, watching the flatness roll past the coach window, that she would not become a burden on the first day, not the first hour, not the first mile. Finn reached under the seat anyway. He pulled out a wool blanket, thick and dark, and smelling faintly of pine smoke and horse, and he laid it across her lap without comment, just settled it there and turned back to face the road as though he had done nothing at all. Something in Elspeth's chest did something she did not have time to examine. She pulled the blanket up to her ribs and thanked him quietly. He corrected her gently. Finn, not Mr. Harrogate. She tried the name in her mouth. It fit. He almost smiled. Ezra grunted from the back of the wagon. Nobody translated the grunt. The road narrowed. The trees pressed closer. Somewhere far off, deeper into the mountain, an owl called once, and then went quiet, and Elspeth understood in that instant that she had left one world and entered another one, and the rules of the new one had not yet been explained to her. An hour into the ride, Jed spoke without looking at her. Something about Callum. He said it the way a man says a name he has not been permitted to say aloud in a long time. The tree, he said, had come down wrong during a spring cut. It had not been quick. Elspeth did not know what response he was looking for. She murmured that she was very sorry. He told her that Callum had been the one who wrote the letters. She had gathered as much. He told her Callum had been 26 years old. 26. The syllable came out smaller than she meant it to. Callum in her imagination had been older, sturdier, a man who had time to grow into the responsibility of a wife. 26 meant he had been a boy, more or less. 26 meant he had written to a stranger in Philadelphia because he was lonely on a mountain, and he had died with her letters in a box somewhere, and his own words scattered on a page she now carried in her reticule. 26 meant she was mourning a person she had never met. She did not want to, but she was. Jed watched the road. He told her Callum had been the fourth of them, the youngest. His mama had died when he was born, and his daddy had raised him up on this mountain along with the rest of them. There wasn't a mean bone in him, not one. He was slow-spoken and gentle, and he loved books, which none of the rest of them did, and he was the only one of them who had ever wanted a wife. Elspeth listened because she understood in the careful cadence of Jed's voice that this was not idle conversation. This was Jed Harrogate telling her who Callum had been, because nobody else was going to, because if she did not know, Callum would be forgotten by the one person on this mountain who had traveled the farthest to find him. She told him she was glad Callum had loved books. Jed's hand tightened on the reins for 1 second, then it loosened. He told her Callum would have liked her. She did not answer. She could not. The road opened up. They came around a bend, and the trees fell back, and Elspeth Fairweather saw for the first time the place she was about to call for a little while at least home. The house was enormous. She had not expected that. She had expected a cabin, a shack, something small and rough, and improvised because the advertisement had said mountain homestead, and Elspeth's imagination had translated that into something modest. But the Harrogate house was 2 stories of hand-cut timber, dark against the snow, with a stone chimney at each end and smoke rising from both of them in twin columns that went straight up in the still cold air. A wrap-around porch, real glass windows, 6 of them, across the front glowing amber with lamplight, a barn larger than the house set back to the east, 2 smaller structures further out, one of which had a smokehouse look about it, and one of which Elspeth could not identify, a corral with 3 horses in it, 1 gray, 1 black, one a small tough-looking brown thing that looked like it could outwork all of them. And beyond the house the mountain kept going up, Whisper Ridge. She now understood the name, because as the wagon rolled to a stop in the yard, and as Ezra jumped down and Finn helped her down, and Jed swung his long body off the driver's seat, the wind came off the top of the mountain, and it moved through the pines with a sound that was not a howl and not a moan, but something in between, a whisper, as though the mountain itself were speaking a language just beneath human hearing, and had been speaking it long before there were humans to hear. She stood in the yard with the blanket clutched around her. She looked up at the house. Behind one of the upstairs windows, a lamp moved. Her head jerked. "Someone else?" she asked. The 3 brothers glanced at each other. Finn explained that would be Mrs. Sable, their housekeeper. She came up from the valley 3 days a week, stayed over. When the weather was bad, she would have supper on. "Oh," Elspeth said again, and she did not know why the presence of another woman in the house made her want to sit down in the snow and weep with relief, but it did. Ezra shouldered her trunk. He carried it up the porch steps and through the front door without a word, and Elspeth watched him go, and she understood that Ezra Harrogate had not yet spoken to her, and she was not certain he was going to. Jed held out his good hand, his right hand. For a moment, Elspeth thought he was going to shake hers, which would have been strange, and then she realized he was helping her up the porch steps, which had a patch of ice on the 3rd one. She took his hand. His grip was warm. The calluses on his palm were the deepest she had ever felt. He let go the moment her boots hit the porch, and she felt the cold rush back in where his warmth had been. She followed him through the front door of the Harrogate house and into the largest single room she had ever entered. Warmth hit her like a wall. She almost staggered. There was a fireplace at the far end, big enough to walk into roaring, with a fire that could have heated 3 ordinary houses. There was a long trestle table down the center of the room, set with tin plates and heavy mugs. There was a kitchen area at the near end, dominated by a black iron stove, and standing at the stove, wooden spoon in one hand and an expression of gentle amazement on her face, was a woman of about 60. She was small, she was round, she had white hair pinned up in a bun and a red checked apron, and a face that had at some point in a long life decided to be kind on purpose. She dropped the spoon, she uttered a soft exclamation, half prayer, half greeting, and told Elspeth she had gotten there at last. Elspeth burst into tears, not loudly, not messily, just quiet, steady tears that ran down her face without warning, and once they started, she could not stop them, and she stood in the middle of the Harrogate kitchen in her navy blue traveling dress, with snow melting on her shoulders, and cried in front of 4 strangers because a woman she had never met had said, "You got here." The 3 brothers stood in the doorway. None of them moved. Ezra actually took half a step backward, as though her tears were a physical thing that might hit him. Mrs. Sable crossed the room. She took Elspeth's face in both her flour-dusted hands and looked up into it, because Elspeth was a full head taller. 9 days on that coach, she murmured half to herself. 9 days and them 3 big galoots meeting her at the platform with news like that. She turned toward the brothers and asked in a tone that was neither soft nor loud which one of them had told her and how badly they had done it. Jed cleared his throat and admitted it was him. Mrs. Sable clicked her tongue and told him she had raised him better. He replied dryly that she had not raised him at all. She corrected him. She had helped. Ezra almost smiled. It was gone before it fully arrived, but Elspeth saw it, and she filed it away because it was the first evidence she had that Ezra Harrogate was a human being with a face that moved. Vesper Sable, apparently, was the housekeeper's name. She steered Elspeth by the shoulders to a chair at the trestle table, sat her down in it, put a mug of coffee in her hands, and did not ask her a single question. She simply moved back to the stove and continued cooking, humming quietly to herself as though a weeping stranger at the supper table was the most ordinary occurrence in the world. The coffee was hot. It was bitter. It was the best thing Elspeth had ever tasted. She wrapped both hands around the mug and drank. The 3 brothers came inside. They shed coats, hats, gloves, and that was when Elspeth got her first proper look at them out of their outdoor layers in the amber light of the fire, and she understood something she had not understood before. They were not, she realized, from the same mother. Jed was the tallest and the leanest, with those pale eyes and dark brown hair and a nose that had at some point been broken and set back not quite right. His left hand, now visible, no longer hidden in a pocket, was scarred badly across the back, and the palm and 3 fingers curled toward the palm at an angle that was clearly not natural. He kept it near his side, not hidden, just quiet. Ezra was broader, darker, with black hair and a beard that reached his chest. His eyes were nearly black. He had the flat cheekbones and the wide-set gaze of a man whose ancestors had come from somewhere Elspeth could not identify, and she remembered suddenly that Finn had said, out on the platform, "My brother Jedediah," not our, my. Finn was somewhere between the two, chestnut hair, gray-green eyes, a face that was closer to Jed's in structure, but softer around the mouth. They were brothers, but they were not, she suspected, brothers in the way the word usually meant. Vesper set a bowl of stew in front of Elspeth, then a bowl in front of Jed, then Finn, then Ezra. Then, without asking, she filled a 5th bowl and set it at the head of the table at an empty place, and Elspeth understood before she had time to think that the 5th bowl was for Callum, and that Vesper Sable had not yet started setting the table for 6 months, and still 5 bowls. Elspeth looked at the empty place. She looked at the 3 brothers. She looked at Vesper, who had turned back to the stove without acknowledgement, and Elspeth Fairweather, who had cried once already tonight and had promised herself she would not do it again, felt the tears come back up, and she pushed them down, and she picked up her spoon, and she ate. The stew was venison. She had never eaten venison before. It was extraordinary. The brothers ate in silence for a long time. Elspeth understood, or thought she understood, that this was not silence born of hostility. This was the silence of men who had eaten together for years and had never needed conversation to be at ease. Every so often, Ezra would pass the bread basket without being asked. Every so often, Jed would refill Finn's mug. It was the small choreography of a household that had learned itself. She did not belong in it. She knew that. She ate anyway. Halfway through the meal, Jed set his spoon down and spoke about the arrangement. She braced. She reminded him before he could continue that there was no arrangement. The arrangement had died in May. He acknowledged that. Then he laid out what he was offering. She could stay through the winter. Passes were closed by mid-December. Nothing would come up this mountain or go down it until March at the earliest. She would have Callum's room. Vesper kept it clean. She would help Vesper with the house if she was willing, and take her meals at the table, and come spring when the road opened, they would put her on the first coach east and pay her fare back to Philadelphia. With what money, the question was out of her mouth before she could stop it. He did not blink. He told her that was for him to figure, not her. Ezra set his spoon down. He did not speak, but the sound of his spoon hitting the table said several things at once, and Elspeth did not need any of them translated. She protested that she did not require charity. Jed corrected her. It wasn't charity. She insisted it sounded like charity. He held her eyes across the table and told her quietly that it was decency. There was a difference. Finn, without looking up from his stew, offered her a small piece of unsolicited wisdom. If she argued with Jed at this point, she would lose. He didn't quit. Elspeth informed the room that neither did she. Finn said that was what he had been afraid of. Vesper snorted from the stove. Elspeth put her spoon down. She folded her hands in her lap. She met Jed's eyes across the trestle table and told him she accepted his terms for the winter and thanked him. But she added in the same level voice that she did not intend to be idle and she did not intend to be pitied, and if she was going to eat at this table, she was going to earn her place. Jed's mouth moved. It was not a smile. It was the ghost of one, the place where a smile lived in a face that had forgotten how to make them. Fair enough, Miss Fairweather, she corrected him. Elspeth. He said her name back to her. Fair enough, Elspeth. The name in his mouth did something to her chest. She did not know what. She did not want to know what. She picked her spoon back up and finished her stew. Vesper took her upstairs after supper. The room had been Callum's. Elspeth understood that the moment the door opened. It was a small room, low-ceilinged, with a single bed against one wall and a plain wooden desk under the window and a bookshelf that took up most of the far wall. The bookshelf was full. Poetry, history, a worn copy of David Copperfield, 3 volumes of a natural history of the Rockies, a Bible. The desk had a lamp on it. Beside the lamp, a small leather-bound journal, and underneath the journal, a stack of letters tied with brown string. Elspeth's letters, her own handwriting on the top envelope, her own careful ink. She stopped in the doorway. Vesper behind her explained quietly that Jed had refused to let anyone move anything. He had said the room would stay as Callum had kept it until it didn't need to anymore. Elspeth murmured that she could not stay in here. Vesper corrected her gently. She could, and she should. Callum would have wanted her to have somewhere warm, and this was the warmest room in the house, because the chimney ran up through the wall behind the bed. Vesper touched her arm and added that Callum had been a sweet boy, and he would have wanted Elspeth to have this room, and what she did with his books and his journal and his letters was up to her now. Elspeth looked at the bed. Someone had made it up fresh. New sheets, a wool quilt folded neatly at the foot, a tin candlestick on the bedside table with a fresh candle in it. Somebody had prepared this room for her. Somebody had prepared it before she arrived, before they knew she was coming. She asked without turning who had made up this bed. Vesper hesitated. There was something in the older woman's face Elspeth did not immediately understand. Jed had done it yesterday when Elspeth's letter came from Cheyenne. He had asked what a lady would want in a room, and Vesper had told him fresh linen and a candle. He had done the rest himself. Elspeth turned around. Vesper was already at the door. She told Elspeth to get some sleep. Tomorrow was a mountain. The door closed. Elspeth stood alone in Callum Harrowgate's room in a house on a mountain 12 miles from the nearest town and 3,000 miles from anyone who had ever loved her, and she looked at the bed that a stranger had made for her yesterday. She sat down on it. She did not weep. She had wept twice today already, and there was a limit, and she had reached it. Instead, she picked up the leather-bound journal on the desk. She did not know why. She did not have the right. But the string on the letters had been tied by Callum, and the letters were hers, and the journal was his, and she was the last person in the world he had written to in a way, and she opened it. The first page was dated 3 years ago. Neat boyish handwriting. She flipped forward, past sketches of birds and pressed leaves and short entries about weather, past notes on cattle and fence lines, and a page of what looked like poetry, half erased, past 3 pages of pencil-drawn maps of the mountain. She stopped. The last entry was dated May 11th, 1884, 6 days before she now understood he had died. The handwriting was different, tight, rushed. The pen had pressed harder into the paper, as though the boy who wrote it had been afraid someone would look over his shoulder. Elspeth read. She came up again today, 3rd time this month. Prudence Ardmore. She stood in the yard and told Jed she'd bought the last of the notes. She smiled the whole time. I don't like when she smiles. Jed didn't say anything to me about it after. He doesn't tell me things when he thinks they'll worry me. But she saw me watching from the barn. She saw me, and she smiled at me too. I know about the silver. I know she knows. I don't think she means to stop at the notes. I don't think she means to stop at anything. If she can get us off this mountain quiet, she will. And if she can't get us off quiet, the entry stopped, mid-sentence. The rest of the page was blank. Elspeth closed the journal. Her hands were cold. She got up from the bed. She walked to the window. Below her in the yard, a lantern was moving. Someone was checking the barn. She could not tell from this angle who it was, only that the shape was tall and broad and carried the lantern in the right hand, which meant either Finn or Jed, and she suspected from the deliberate quiet of the movement that it was Jed. She watched him disappear into the barn. She watched the lantern glow softly through the barn's slatted walls. She watched him come out again a few minutes later, close the door latchet, and stand for a moment in the falling snow with his head tipped back, looking up at the mountain. He was not looking at her window, but she was looking at him. And she thought very clearly, in a voice that surprised her with its steadiness, whatever Prudence Ardmore meant to do to these men, she was going to have to go through Elspeth first. Elspeth Fairweather had never had a thought like that in her life. She sat down at Callum's desk. She opened the journal to a blank page near the back. She picked up his pen. She dipped it in the small pot of ink he had left dry now, but salvageable if she spat into it, which she did without thinking, because her mother had taught her that resourcefulness was more important than dignity when dignity had run out. She wrote at the top of the page, "Things I have learned in one day at Whisper Ridge." Underneath it, she made her list. Callum Harrogate was dead. His brothers did not want a bride, but they would feed one. One of them had made her bed with his own hands before she arrived. There was a woman in the valley called Prudence Ardmore, and she was not their friend. Callum had known something before he died, and Elspeth Fairweather was going to find out what. She read the list twice. Then she blew out the candle and undressed by moonlight, and she lay down in the bed that a stranger had made for her, and she slept the deepest sleep of her adult life. She woke before dawn. She did not remember why. She lay in the dark listening, and after a moment she understood. Someone was in the yard. Someone was moving quietly. Someone was doing something they did not want to be heard doing. She got up. She wrapped the wool quilt around her shoulders. She crossed to the window. The yard was gray with pre-dawn light, and the snow had stopped falling in the night, and in the gray light at the edge of the yard, where the trees began, stood a figure in a dark coat. Not one of the brothers. The figure was smaller, a man but slighter. He was standing at the edge of the tree line, and he was looking directly at the house. Elspeth stepped back from the window. She did not know why, but something in the way the figure was standing made her not want to be seen. She waited. 10 seconds. 20. When she looked again, the figure was gone. The tree line was empty. The snow at the edge of the yard was smooth and unbroken, except for a single set of boot prints leading in from the west and back out again the same way. Her heart was beating in her throat. She dressed quickly, silently, and she went downstairs. The kitchen was dark. The fire had burned down to embers. Vesper was not there yet. It was too early even for her. But Jed was. Jed Harrogate was sitting at the trestle table in the near-dark coffee mug in his good hand, an unopened envelope on the table in front of him. He was staring at it. He looked up when she came in. He was not surprised to see her. He simply confirmed, without needing to be told, that she had seen him too. She nodded. He glanced back down at the envelope. He told her quietly that it had come yesterday, and that he had been planning to give it to Vesper, to burn without reading, because he had received 6 of them since May, and they all said the same thing, and he did not need to hear it again. 6 letters, same handwriting, same envelope, same message underneath the polite words. He slid the envelope across the table toward her. The handwriting was elegant, copperplate, a woman's hand. The name on the front read, Mr. J. Harrogate, Whisper Ridge. There was no return address. Only in the lower left corner, in the same elegant hand, the initials P.A. Elspeth touched the envelope. She looked up. His eyes in the firelight were not cold anymore. They were tired. They were the eyes of a man who had been fighting alone for a long time, and who had, just whether he liked it or not, acquired an ally. Open it, she told him. He asked her gently to please stop calling him Mr. Harrogate. Jed. She corrected herself. Jed. He picked up the envelope. He broke the seal. He unfolded the letter inside, and he read it in silence. And Elspeth watched his face, and she watched something in his jaw tighten by degrees, and she watched at the very end his good hand curl slowly into a fist against the tabletop. He set the letter down and told her in a voice that was too flat to be calm that Prudence Ardmore was calling the note. 30 days, $600. Elspeth reached across the table. She turned the letter around. She read it, and she saw the acceleration clause in the second paragraph, and she saw the wording, and something in her chest went absolutely still, because Elspeth Fairweather, for 3 years before she came to Montana, had been the ward and gratis secretary of Theodore Van Wyck, and Theodore Van Wyck had made his fortune in Philadelphia banking, and Elspeth had read more loan documents than any 22-year-old woman in America. She read it twice. She asked him very quietly whether he had the original note. He frowned. She clarified. The note his father had signed when he had borrowed the money. Not this letter, not this demand. The paper his father had actually signed. He stared at her. It was in the strong box. Had he read it recently? Not since he was 14 years old. Bring me the strong box, she told him. I did not move. He looked at her for a long moment, this stranger who had wept in his kitchen last night and made a list of promises to herself in his dead brother's journal, and something moved behind his eyes, something careful, something reassessing. He stood up. He walked to the office at the back of the house. He came back with a black metal strongbox and a small brass key. He set it on the table between them. He unlocked it. He lifted the lid. Inside, on top of a small stack of papers, yellowed with age and pipe smoke, was a folded document dated April 3rd, 1878. The paper was heavy. The ink was faded but legible. The signature at the bottom was steady and firm. Silas Nathaniel Harrogate, their father. Elspeth picked up the document. She unfolded it. She read every line of it twice, and when she reached the end, she looked up, and her face was pale, and her eyes were very bright. She began to speak in short, precise sentences. The original loan was for $250, not $600. He went still. The interest was 5%, not 12, stiller, and there was no acceleration clause in the document. None. The paper said his father had 10 years to pay at his own pace with no penalty for late payment as long as the principal was reduced by at least $20 a year, which meant. She stopped. She looked up. Jed Harrogate was looking at her the way a drowning man looks at a rope, which meant she said that Prudence Ardmore was not calling his note. Prudence Ardmore was committing forgery, and she had been doing it, if Elspeth had to guess, for a great deal longer than 6 months. The room was very still. Outside somewhere on the mountain, an owl called, just once, and Jed Harrogate, sitting across a trestle table from a 22-year-old mail-order bride whose intended husband was in the ground and whose entire fortune was 2 silver coins and a lock of her mother's hair, looked at Elspeth Fairweather for a long, long moment. Then he stood up. He walked to the foot of the stairs. He called up into the dark of the second floor in a voice that Elspeth had not yet heard from him, low, level, and absolutely without doubt. Ezra, Finn, get down here. He turned back to Elspeth. His eyes caught the last of the firelight. It appeared he told her that she was going to earn her place at this table a good deal sooner than he had expected. Outside the kitchen window, in the pale gray light of the coming dawn, The snow at the edge of the tree line lay unbroken and silent. The boot prints were gone. Whoever had stood there in the night had walked back into the trees, and the trees on Whisper Ridge kept their secrets. For now, Ezra came down the stairs first. He had pulled on trousers and a wool undershirt, and his black hair was still tangled from sleep, and his beard was pushed sideways, where his cheek had been on the pillow. He looked, Elspeth thought, like a bear that had been woken too early and was still deciding whether the situation justified the effort. Finn followed 30 seconds later. His shirt was buttoned wrong. He did not seem to have noticed. The two of them stood in the doorway of the kitchen and looked at the strongbox open on the trestle table, at the two documents lying side by side, at Elspeth in her hastily pinned hair, leaning over the papers, at Jed, standing over her with an expression that had not been on his face in 6 months. Ezra spoke. For the first time since Elspeth had met him, Ezra Harrogate spoke. His voice was deeper than she expected, deeper and slower and more careful, like a man who did not waste words because he had once, somewhere in his life, learned that words were expensive. He observed quietly that somebody had died. Not yet, Jed corrected him, but somebody was about to. Finn's eyes went to Elspeth and asked whether she was all right. She told him she was. She asked both of them to sit down. They sat, not because she had asked, but because Jed had nodded at the bench, and Elspeth was beginning to understand the small, silent economies of the Harrogate brothers. And one of them was that Jed nodded and the others moved. Vesper came in from the back door with an armful of firewood and stopped short. She took in the tableau at the table. She offered a dry assessment of the situation and asked whether she should put on more coffee or leave. Jed told her coffee and to close the door. She closed the door. She set the firewood by the stove. She began the coffee without another word, and Elspeth had the sudden clear thought that Vesper Sable had been through worse mornings than this one in her 60 years, and that whatever was coming, Vesper had already decided to stay for it. Elspeth turned the two documents so all three brothers could see them. She placed them side by side. The original note on the left, yellowed folded, dated 1878. The letter from Prudence Ardmore on the right, crisp and white, and dated 3 days ago. Look at this, she told them. They looked. Ezra's dark eyes moved slowly across the older document. His finger, blunt and scarred and enormous, moved along the lines of ink as he read. Finn read faster. Finn's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. That wasn't the same paper, Finn observed. Elspeth agreed. The numbers weren't the same. She agreed again. The interest wasn't. Finn stopped. He looked up at Jed, then at Elspeth, then back at the papers, and Elspeth watched the youngest Harrogate brother's face go through, in the space of about 8 seconds, a series of changes that took him from confusion to comprehension to something that looked very much like a young man's first taste of adult fury. She was stealing from them, Finn said quietly. Yes, Elspeth confirmed. She had been stealing from them. Yes. For how long? Elspeth did not know yet. Ezra had not moved. Ezra was still looking at the papers, and when he finally spoke again, his voice was different. It was quieter than before, and slower, and somewhere underneath it was something Elspeth did not want to examine too closely. He said only one word, Callum. Jed's jaw set. He told his brother they did not know that. Ezra repeated the name. Jed repeated the warning. They did not know that. Ezra spoke again, slower, listing what he knew. Callum had been up here that spring. Prudence had come up twice in April, twice in May. Callum had written something in his book about her, and then Callum had gone out to fell that pine, and Callum had come back under it. His finger tapped the tabletop once, just once, but the tap had the weight of a courtroom gavel. Elspeth looked between the brothers. She understood because she had ears, and because she had eyes, and because Callum's own journal was in her possession, 3 doors up the stairs, that Ezra had said out loud what nobody in this house had been willing to say out loud for 6 months, that Callum's death had not been an accident, that somebody had helped that tree come down. Jed closed his eyes for one long moment. When he opened them, they were the coldest thing Elspeth had ever seen. He addressed Ezra directly, laying it out with the precision of a man who had already thought this through and did not intend to think it through again. If they went down that road this morning with no proof they lost, she wanted them angry. She wanted Finn or Ezra or Jed himself to ride into Ironwood Falls with a rifle and settle it in front of witnesses so she could hang them for it and take this mountain the clean way. Ezra asked quietly what they were going to do instead. They were going to do it her way, Jed told him. On paper, in court, with witnesses she couldn't buy. Ezra pointed out without heat that she had bought every witness in this valley for 30 years. Jed corrected him. She had not bought all of them. Silence. Vesper set 4 mugs of coffee on the table. She did not sit down. She stood behind Jed's shoulder like a woman guarding a door. Finn turned to Elspeth. He asked her what they were going to do. The room turned toward her. 3 enormous mountain men and 1 small round housekeeper, all looking at a 22-year-old girl in a navy blue traveling dress who had been in their house for less than 12 hours. Elspeth felt her hands tremble. She put them flat on the table so nobody would see. They were going to need 3 things, she told them, and they were going to need them fast. She held up 1 finger. First, they needed to know who had written the original note, not the man who had lent the money. Their father had borrowed from a bank, yes, territorial bank, of Helena, Jed confirmed, 6 years back. Then somewhere in that bank, or somewhere retired from it, was a man who had signed the original note and remembered what it said. They needed him, in writing, with witnesses. Second finger, they needed to find out how many other families in this valley Prudence Ardmore had done this to. If she had done it to the Harrogates, she had done it to others. And if she had done it to others, they needed those others willing to speak. Third finger, they needed to keep her from knowing that they knew. Until they had the first 2, the third was the only thing keeping them alive. If she realized they had read the original note, she would move faster than they could. So from this moment forward, in this house, nothing had changed. Jed was to look worried about the debt. Ezra was to look like Ezra. Finn was to look like Finn. Vesper was to keep making coffee. Vesper snorted from the stove. She informed the kitchen that she had been making coffee for these men for 18 years, and she was not about to stop now. Good Elspeth told her. She picked up her mug. Her hand was still trembling. She took a sip anyway, and the coffee burned her tongue, and she did not care. Jed was watching her. There was something new in his face. She did not have a name for it. She did not want one. She asked him who the bank manager had been, who had written the original note. Did he remember the name? Jed thought. Finch. Obadiah Finch. His father had used to say Finch was the only honest banker in Montana Territory. Was he still alive? Last Jed had heard. Retired to a place outside Helena about 6 years back, but that was 6 years ago, and he had already been an old man then, 65 maybe. Then he was 71 now. If he was alive, they needed to find him. Helena was 30 miles, she knew. In November, she knew that too. Then Jed said her name in a way that made her stop. He was looking at her steadily. She didn't ride, he pointed out. She corrected him. She did. Not these mountains, he clarified. Not in snow, not on a road that closed in 3 weeks. This wasn't Philadelphia. She was aware, she told him. Then he needed her to be aware that if she fell off that horse and broke her neck on the way to Helena, he would not be able to forgive himself, and he had enough things he couldn't forgive himself for. The silence that followed that sentence was different from the silence before it. Vesper turned back to the stove very deliberately. Finn found something extremely interesting about the grain of the tabletop. Ezra just looked at his older brother with an expression Elspeth could not read. Elspeth put her mug down. She met Jed's eyes across the papers. Then he could teach her how to ride these mountains before they went, she informed him, because she was going with him, Jedediah Harrogate. She was the only person in this house who had read enough loan documents to know what questions to ask Obadiah Finch, and she was not going to sit on this mountain and knit while 3 men rode into the valley to fight a woman she had already promised in her own head to bring down. She had not meant to say the last part out loud. It came out anyway. Ezra's beard moved. She realized after a second that Ezra Harrogate was smiling, only slightly, only for a moment, but it was the second smile she had seen on him in 12 hours, and it was directed at her, and Elspeth understood in that instant that she had passed some invisible test she had not known she was taking. Jed exhaled slowly. 2 days, he told her. She had 2 days. He would teach her what he could, if he could. If at the end of 2 days she could stay on a horse in the snow, she came to Helena. If she couldn't, she stayed here with Finn, and Ezra rode down with him instead. Fair, he asked. Fair, she confirmed. He turned to Ezra. Ezra would keep watch on the house while they were gone. Whoever had stood at the tree line last night knew something. He didn't want Vesper alone up here. Ezra confirmed he wasn't leaving. Then Jed turned to Finn. Finn was to ride into Ironwood Falls the next day. Careful, feed and nails and back the same day. But while he was there, he was to listen, not ask. Listen. Who was grumbling? Who was short on cash? Who owed Ardmore what? Finn nodded, and Jed added dryly, no drinking. Finn made a face like a man who had been asked to give up something dear and complained that Jed wounded him. Jed replied that he had wounded Finn before and Finn had survived. Vesper laughed. The sound was so unexpected in that room at that moment that even Ezra's mouth twitched again, and Elspeth Fairweather, sitting at a trestle table on Whisper Ridge, with the yellowed 1878 note under her hand and the fraudulent 1884 letter beside it, felt for the first time in 9 days that she had not in fact come to the end of her story. She had come to the beginning of a different one. The riding lessons started at first light. Jed handed her a pair of boys' trousers and a heavy woolen coat, and Elspeth took them without comment and went upstairs and changed, and she looked at herself in the small square mirror above Callum's wash basin, and she did not recognize the woman in the reflection. Her honey blonde hair was pinned tight against her head under one of Callum's old wool caps. Her face was pale but composed. She looked like a boy of 15 if you did not look at her eyes. She went downstairs. Ezra looked at her once. Ezra looked away. Finn choked on his coffee. Jed simply told her approvingly that she looked ready and led her out. The horse was called Millie. Millie was the small, tough brown one that Elspeth had noticed in the corral, and Jed had chosen her because he explained Millie had once carried Callum for 3 days through a January snowstorm with a broken foreleg and hadn't lost him once. Elspeth stroked Millie's nose. Millie snorted warm air against her hand. Elspeth loved her instantly. Jed showed her how to mount, how to sit, how to hold the reins in the way that told a horse what to do without hurting its mouth, how to shift her weight for a turn, how to stand in the stirrups going uphill, how to lean back going down. She fell 4 times in the first hour. The snow was deep. The falls did not hurt. She got back on every time without being asked, and by the 4th fall, Jed had stopped offering to help her up, and she understood that this was not cruelty. It was respect. By noon on the first day, she could stay on Millie at a walk. By dusk, at a slow trot. By noon on the second day, she was cantering through the pines on a trail that ran along the ridge, with Jed on his big gray gelding half a length ahead of her, and she felt something she had not felt in years, which was the specific joy of her body doing something her mind had not believed possible. She laughed. It came out of nowhere. Jed turned in the saddle. He was looking at her. His face did something she had not seen before. It softened, not much, but enough. He turned back to the trail without saying anything, and Elspeth Fairweather rode behind Jedediah Harrogate through the pines of Whisper Ridge on the 2nd afternoon of December 1884, and she thought for one clear second, and no more, oh no. Then she pushed the thought down as far as it would go, and she followed him back to the house. They left for Helena on the 3rd morning. Ezra saddled the horses in the pre-dawn dark. Vesper packed food in oiled paper, hard cheese, dried apple slices, cold biscuit, jerked venison. She wrapped each package separately and tied them with string, and she pushed them into Elspeth's saddlebag with the specific care of a mother who was not going to say aloud what she was thinking. Finn stood at Elspeth's stirrup. He asked her quietly to come back. She promised she would. He shook his head, insisting he meant it. His brother, he explained, wasn't the same man he had been 6 months ago. He hadn't smiled since Callum. He hadn't slept a full night. And Finn had seen his face when Elspeth had laughed on the ridge yesterday, so he needed her to come back. Please. Elspeth looked down at him. She did not know what to do with what he had just said. She promised him again, gently. He nodded. He stepped back. Jed swung up onto his gray gelding. He looked at her. She looked at him. Ready, he checked. Ready, she confirmed. They rode. The road down from Whisper Ridge was worse than Elspeth remembered. The wagon ride up had been rough. The horseback ride down in December on a trail half buried in fresh powder was another category of experience entirely. Millie picked her footing with a delicacy Elspeth would not have thought possible in a horse. Jed's gray was less delicate, but more powerful, and Jed himself sat the saddle the way a man sits a chair he has been sitting in since childhood. They did not talk for the first 3 hours. The mountain would not let them. The mountain wanted concentration. Then around mid-morning, the trees fell back, and the trail widened into an old logging road, and Jed slowed his horse so that Elspeth's Millie could come up alongside. He told her she was doing fine. She thanked him. He clarified. He meant it. Better than fine. She had a seat on her. She admitted she had had lessons as a girl. Her father had been a physician who rode to house calls in the country. He had put her up on his mare when she was 6. She had fallen off a lot. Fell off any less, he asked. Eventually, she smiled. He almost smiled back. They rode in silence for another mile. Then Jed cleared his throat and asked about her father. She told him her father had died when she was 8. He offered his condolences quietly. She waved them off. It was a long time ago. He observed that didn't stop being what it was. She looked at him sideways. The wind had reddened his cheeks above the beard. Snow clung to his hat brim. His eyes were fixed on the road ahead, but she had the strange sense that he was somewhere else in a different snow a long time ago. She asked about his father. 9 years back, he told her. How, she asked. His heart. In his sleep, which people said was a blessing, and it was, but Jed had never forgiven him for going without warning. Elspeth's breath caught. The words were almost exactly the words she had used to herself about her own father silently in a kitchen in Philadelphia for 20 years. She told him she knew exactly what he meant. He looked at her. She looked at him. For one long second on a logging road on the shoulder of a mountain in Montana Territory in December of 1884, Elspeth Fairweather understood that she was in trouble. Then Jed observed, in a different tone, that a storm was coming in. She followed his eyes. To the west above the tree line, the sky had gone the color of wet slate, not gray, not blue, slate, and the wind, which had been steady at their backs all morning, was now doing something more complicated, pulling at their coats from 2 directions at once, as though the mountain could not decide which way to push them. How bad, she asked. Bad enough. They wouldn't make Helena tonight. What did they do? There was an old miner's cabin about 2 miles ahead off the road. Nobody had lived in it since the 70s, but the roof had been sound last spring. If they rode hard, they could make it before the worst. Then they rode hard, she told him. He looked at her once. Then he kicked the gray into a canter, and Millie followed, without needing to be asked. And Elspeth held on with everything her 2 days of lessons had taught her. And behind them the storm came down off the mountain like a hand closing. They made the cabin. Just. The snow was already coming sideways when Jed threw open the door and hauled Elspeth off her horse and shoved her inside with one arm while he unsaddled both animals with the other. He dragged the saddles in. He led the horses into a lean-to along the side of the cabin that Elspeth had not noticed. He piled brush against the lean-to's open side. He came back through the cabin door and slammed it behind him and dropped the wooden bar into its brackets, and only then did he stop moving. I was breathing hard. Snow melted on his beard. Elspeth was standing in the middle of a single-room cabin, the size of Callum's bedroom, and the wind was already screaming past the shuttered window, and there was one narrow bed against one wall and a small iron stove in the corner, and nothing else. Jed looked at the bed. He looked at Elspeth. He looked at the bed again. He announced he would sleep on the floor. She told him not to be absurd. He would freeze. He said he would be fine. She said his full name, Jedediah. He stopped. She had not called him that before. She had not called any man by his full given name in the tone she had just used, and she was not entirely sure where the tone had come from, but it was there and it had worked. She laid it out for him. He would build them a fire. He would unpack what Vesper had packed them. They would figure out sleeping arrangements when they were no longer at risk of dying of exposure. Yes, he nodded slowly. He built the fire. The cabin small, as it was warmed quickly. Jed had stockpiled dry wood there in some previous autumn, and the little stove had a good draft, and within 20 minutes, Elspeth could feel her fingers again. She unpacked Vesper's food. She melted snow in the tin cup Jed had brought. She made a kind of soup with the jerked venison and the cheese and hot water and salt and it was in every measurable way disgusting. But it was hot, and they were alive, and she handed him his cup and sat down across from him on the packed dirt floor of the cabin, and they ate. The wind screamed, the cabin held. After a while, Jed set his empty cup down. He looked at her across the fire. He told her he wanted to tell her something, because he didn't know when he'd have another chance, and because she had earned it. She waited. Han held up his left hand, slowly, deliberately. He turned it in the firelight so she could see the ridged white scars across the back, the pale twist where two of the fingers no longer straighten, the deep line running from the base of his thumb down into his wrist. 6 years ago, he began. Ezra had been in his late 20s, then still learning the mountain, and he had wandered off into the north woods after a runaway calf. It had been fall. There had been a bear on their mountain that year, a big grizzly with a sow's fury about her. She had taken 2 of their hogs and a colt. Jed had been tracking her for a week. His voice was very quiet. Elspeth could barely hear him over the storm. I had found Ezra before she did, just barely. She had come out of the brush behind him. Jed had put himself between them. He had had the rifle and one shot, and he had taken it and hit her in the shoulder, and it hadn't been enough. She had come for him instead of Ezra, which had been the point of the whole exercise. She had gotten his hand in her mouth before he got the second shot into her ear. He didn't remember the second shot. Ezra said he had done it. Ezra had carried him out 3 miles on his own back. Elspeth said nothing. Her throat had closed. Jed lowered his hand. The girl he had been engaged to, he told her. Meredith. She had come up to see him while he was still healing. She had looked at the hand, and she had said, and he remembered this exactly, that she couldn't marry a man who was only half a man, and she had gone home to her people, and he had never seen her again. The fire popped. Something in Elspeth's chest split open. She did not know she was moving until she was already moving. She crossed the small space between them on her knees, and she took his damaged hand in both of hers, and she held it the way she would have held a wounded bird, and she looked at the ridged white scars in the firelight, and she felt every one of them under her thumbs. Then she lifted his hand to her mouth, and she pressed her lips to the back of it, right over the deepest scar. She told him quietly and clearly, so he could not misunderstand her, that there was not a single part of him that was only half a man. Meredith had been a fool, and she would not have another word said against this hand in her hearing. Jed did not move. He did not breathe. He was looking at her the way a man looks at a miracle he does not believe in but cannot stop seeing. He said her name softly. She answered. I was 40 years old. She was aware. She was 22. She was aware of that also. He had a mountain, a debt, 3 brothers, and a bad hand. He had nothing to offer any woman, and certainly not one like her. She told him then that it was fortunate she was not asking him for anything at this particular moment. She sat back. She released his hand. She returned to her side of the fire, and she folded her own hands in her lap, and she looked at him steadily across the flames. But when this business with Prudence Ardmore was finished, she informed him she intended to have a conversation with Jedediah Harrogate, and she intended for him to be prepared for it. And in the meantime, they were going to sleep in the same bed because they would freeze otherwise, and he was going to be a gentleman about it, and she was going to be a lady about it, and they were going to Helena in the morning to save his mountain. Agreed. The look on his face. She would remember it for the rest of her life. Agreed. The storm blew itself out sometime before dawn. Elspeth woke to the smell of coffee. Jed had built the fire back up. He was crouched in front of the stove with the tin cup, and he had, at some point in the night, made a fresh brew from grounds she had not seen him packing. She sat up. The wool blanket slid off her shoulder. He did not turn around, but he informed her that there was a stream about 100 yards down the slope, that the roof of the lean-to had caught snow all night, and that he had melted a cupful for washing. It was on the ledge by the door. She thanked him. He said her name. Yes. He turned then. His eyes in the morning firelight were softer than she had ever seen them. About last night, he began. She stopped him. He shook his head. He wasn't withdrawing. He was affirming. He wanted to be clear on that. Elspeth's face went warm. She looked down at the blanket in her lap. Then they understood each other, she told him. Yes, ma'am. She asked for coffee. He handed her the cup. Their fingers touched. Neither of them looked away. They reached Helena by 3 in the afternoon. Obadiah Finch's cottage was 2 miles outside town on a rise overlooking a small frozen creek. Smoke rose from the chimney. A pair of chickens scratched at the base of the porch. The old man himself opened the door before Jed could knock, and he stood in the doorway squinting at them, and he was indeed 71 and small and white-haired, and his eyes were bright with an intelligence that age had not touched. He looked at Jed for a long moment, then his face changed. Silas Harrowgate's boy. Yes, sir. Which one? Jedediah. The eldest. Yes, sir. The old man's eyes moved to Elspeth. He asked who she was. Jed hesitated. Elspeth stepped forward and introduced herself, and told him she had come from Whisper Ridge with Mr. Harrowgate to discuss a loan document his bank had issued in 1878. May they come in? Obadiah Finch looked at her for a long, appraising moment. Then his mouth curved in a small, dry smile. He told her in a voice that was more amused than surprised that in 50 years of banking he had learned to tell within about 30 seconds when someone at his door was about to make his afternoon interesting. He invited them in. He put the kettle on. They sat at his kitchen table. Elspeth laid out the original note and the recent letter. Obadiah Finch put on a pair of half spectacles and read both documents twice through, and he did not speak while he read. And when he finished, he took the spectacles off and set them on the table and looked at Elspeth Fairweather across a cottage kitchen in Helena, Montana territory, and his eyes were no longer soft. They were fierce. He asked her quietly who was currently holding this note. Elspeth told him. A woman in Ironwood Falls named Prudence Ardmore. Obadiah Finch was very still. His hand curled slowly around his teacup. He needed them to listen to him carefully. He told them. They listened. I had written that note himself. He had signed it. He remembered it because Silas Harrowgate had been one of the most decent men he had ever loaned money to, and because Silas had insisted on plain terms and Obadiah had given them to him. $250, 5%, 10-year term, no acceleration clause. He had initialed every page of that document with his own hand. He paused, and he wanted to tell them that the letter he tapped it, which claimed to be a demand under the terms of that same note, was a forgery. The interest rate had been altered, the principal had been altered, and an acceleration clause had been inserted that had never been in the original document, and that Silas Harrowgate would never have signed, and that Obadiah would never have written. He looked up. Furthermore, this was the 4th time in 3 years he had been visited by someone bringing him documents from that woman. Jed sat forward. The fourth, Mr. Harrowgate. There was a family named Riverson. There was a family named Abbott. There was a family named Wesley. All three had sat at this table before them. All three had shown him letters from Prudence Ardmore claiming to hold notes he had originated at terms he had never written, calling in debts that were not due. He had given each of them a signed statement to that effect. He had told each of them to take those statements to the circuit court. He paused. None of them had. Why not? Because Obadiah Finch said quietly, one of them, the Wesley boy, had been found dead in his barn a week after their meeting. Hanged, they said. Suicide. His widow had burned Obadiah's statement in the kitchen stove and moved back to her mother's people in Iowa within the month. The Abbotts had sold their land to Prudence Ardmore for pennies and left. The Riversons had stayed, but they had never spoken of it since, and they did not answer their door when he knocked. The silence in the small kitchen was absolute. Elspeth felt Jed go very still beside her. She addressed Obadiah Finch by name. She asked whether he would write her a statement. Today, signed, witnessed if they could find a witness, detailing what he had just told them. The old man looked at her. His face was grave. He told her he was 71 years old. He had a heart condition. His wife was buried in the churchyard down the hill, and he did not have children. And if that woman decided to come for him, there was very little he could do to stop her. He paused. His eyes were steady. He would write her statement, young lady. He would sign it. He would get his neighbor Josiah to witness it. He had been waiting for 6 years for someone to walk in that door and take this fight where it needed to go. If she was that someone, then God had finally answered a prayer he had stopped saying out loud, and he was not going to leave her standing on his porch. Elspeth put her hand over his on the table. She did not speak. She did not need to. The statement was written by lamplight. Obadiah Finch wrote in a spidery, elegant hand that had once in a former life signed thousands of loan documents. He named names. He gave dates. He described the original Harrogate note in detail so specific that no forgery could touch it. He described the Riverson Abbott and Wesley visits in the same detail. He signed his own name at the bottom. His neighbor Josiah came over. Josiah was a farmer of about 60 who did not ask what he was witnessing. He signed. He shook Jed's hand. He said offhandedly that Silas Harrogate had saved his mule from a barn fire in 1871, and Jed was to tell his mama Josiah said hello. Jed replied quietly that his mother had been gone 30 years, sir. Then Jed was to tell her in his prayers. Elspeth folded the statement carefully. She placed it in a leather portfolio Vesper had packed at the bottom of her saddlebag, and she buckled the portfolio inside her coat against her ribs, where it would ride against her body until she was home. Obadiah Finch walked them to the door. He looked at Elspeth for a long moment. He told her that when this was over, if he was still alive, he would very much like to know how it ended. She promised him he would be the first to know. He nodded. He shook Jed's hand. He watched them mount up. He stood in the doorway of his cottage until they were out of sight down the road, and Elspeth did not turn around because she was afraid that if she did, she would see an old man standing alone in a doorway, and she was afraid of what that image would do to her. They rode back toward Whisper Ridge with the portfolio against her ribs and the statement burning against her skin like a hot coal, and Jed did not speak for a long time, and neither did she, and around them the mountains held their peace. They made it home late on the 4th day. Vesper had a candle in every window. Finn was on the porch before they were off their horses. He half ran to Elspeth's stirrup and helped her down like she was made of china, and she almost laughed at him, and then she saw his face. His face was gray. Ezra was inside, he told her. She asked him sharply what had happened. Finn shook his head. Ezra would tell her. Ezra hadn't wanted him to send for them, but someone had come up here 2 nights ago in the dark. Jed swung down from the gray. Who, he demanded. Finn hadn't seen the face. Ezra had gotten a shot off. They thought he had hit whoever it was in the arm. There was blood in the snow, but they had gotten away, and Finn continued they had set fire to the smokehouse. The color left Jed's face. He asked how much they had lost. Half the winter's meat. And Finn continued, when the smokehouse was burning, Ezra had run out to the yard, and while he had been fighting the fire, someone else had gotten into the barn. They had cut the lead horse's tendons on both hind legs. She would never work again. Ezra had put her down last night. Jed closed his eyes. Elspeth watched a muscle jump in his jaw. She had seen enough now to know exactly what he was doing. She had seen him do it in the storm cabin, and she had seen him do it on the ride down to Helena. He was gathering himself. He was refusing to give the enemy the gift of his anger. He opened his eyes. He told Finn to get Elspeth inside, get her fed, get her warm. Finn asked what about him. Jed said he needed to see Ezra. He walked past them into the house. Elspeth watched him go. She turned to Finn. She asked him to take her to Ezra. Now, not to the kitchen, to wherever Ezra was. Finn hesitated. Then he nodded. He led her around the side of the house, through the yard, past the black, wet ruin of the smokehouse to the barn. Ezra was sitting on a hay bale. His rifle was across his knees. His right sleeve was pushed up to the elbow, and there was a long, shallow cut running down the length of his forearm, and it was clumsily bandaged with a strip of shirt. Vesper was crouched in front of him with a basin of hot water. She was not speaking. He was not speaking. Elspeth stepped into the barn. Ezra looked up. His flat black eyes rested on her for one long moment. Then, in that slow, careful voice, he greeted her. She greeted him back. She asked whether they had gotten what they went for. Yes. Signed statement. Signed and witnessed. Good. He looked back down at his arm. Vesper resumed cleaning the cut. Elspeth crossed the barn slowly and sat down on the hay bale beside him. Not close, but not far either. She asked him to show her the cut. He held it out. She took his massive hand in hers and turned the arm to catch the lantern light. The cut was long but not deep. It had not needed to be. It had been meant as a warning. She looked up at him. She asked whether whoever had done this had said anything. They hadn't gotten the chance. Good. Then Ezra told her in the same slow voice that she needed to know something. He paused. He seemed to be choosing his words the way a man chooses stones to walk across a river. When the smokehouse had gone up, he had run out to the yard, but Vesper had been in the kitchen. She had heard the barn door open behind her. She had come out with a poker. She had seen someone at the tack wall. She had said it had been a woman. Elspeth went cold. A woman, small, cloaked, face covered, moved wrong, like she was hurt or old or both. He looked at her. It hadn't been Prudence Ardmore. Prudence wouldn't come herself, but it had been a woman, and she had been in this barn, and she had left something. He reached under the hay bale. He drew out a folded piece of paper. He handed it to Elspeth. She unfolded it in the lantern light. The paper was cream-colored, expensive, and the message was written in a hand Elspeth did not recognize. Not the copperplate elegance of Prudence Ardmore's letters. Something rougher, something desperate. The note said in 6 words, "She killed Callum." Ask me how. At the bottom, one initial. D. Elspeth looked up at Ezra. Ezra looked back. Vesper, still crouched in the straw at his feet, went absolutely still. And outside the barn on the ridge above the house, an owl called. Just once. Elspeth folded the note. Her hands were steady. She did not know how her hands were steady, but they were, and she folded the paper the way her mother had once folded funeral letters, along the same creases 3 times until the message was small enough to fit in a locket. She looked at Ezra. She looked at Vesper. Whoever this D was, she told them quietly she knew, and she had come here at great risk to tell them, which meant she was either dying or trapped or both. Ezra's jaw worked once. Vesper stood up from the straw and offered a piece of information she had been holding for a long moment. There was a woman, she said slowly, been staying at the Ardmore house on and off since the summer, kept indoors, coughed at night. The washerwoman had told her, said Prudence kept her upstairs, wouldn't let her out, wouldn't let anyone up to see her. Who was she? Nobody in town knew her name. Prudence introduced her as a niece from back east when she had to introduce her at all, which wasn't often. Elspeth's chest tightened, because a niece from back east, because a woman kept indoors, because she killed Callum, because Callum had written in a journal upstairs in a house on a mountain. Prudence Ardmore stood in the yard and told Jed she'd bought the last of the notes. She smiled the whole time. I don't like when she smiles. Elspeth stood up from the hay bale. She did not shake. She had at some point in the last 4 days run out of the capacity to shake. She asked Vesper quietly to tell Jed she needed to see him in Callum's room. When he was finished speaking with Ezra, Vesper hesitated. Elspeth said, "Only please." Vesper looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded. Elspeth walked out of the barn, across the yard, past the black ruin of the smokehouse, and into the house. She climbed the stairs. She went into Callum's room. She sat down at Callum's desk, and she opened Callum's journal to the last written entry, and she read the last sentence one more time. If she can get us off this mountain quiet, she will. And if she can't get us off quiet, she picked up the pen. She dipped it in ink she had refilled that morning, underneath Callum's unfinished sentence. In her own careful hand, Elspeth Fairweather completed his thought. She would send someone to help them go loudly. And now that someone had come to them instead, Callum, Elspeth was going to finish this for him. She closed the journal. The door opened behind her. Jed stood in the doorway. He did not step in because a man did not in 1884 step uninvited into a lady's bedchamber. But he looked at her across the threshold, and there was something in his eyes that had not been there 4 days ago. And Elspeth stood up and crossed to him and handed him the folded note. He read it. He read it twice. His good hand closed slowly into a fist. He said the initial aloud. She confirmed it. Who, he asked her. Vesper said there was a woman at the Ardmore house. Been there since summer. Kept upstairs. Coughed at night. Prudence called her a niece. Jed went very still. He was looking at the note, but he was not. Elspeth understood seeing it. He was seeing something else. He told her then of a story his father had never finished telling him. When his father had been drinking, which wasn't often, he had started to say it, and then he had stopped. Something about a woman he had known before Jed's mother, before he came west. A woman he had left in St. Louis with a promise he couldn't keep. He had never told Jed her name, but he had said once, if a woman ever comes up this mountain looking for what's owed her, Jed, you give it. You give whatever it is. Elspeth's mouth went dry. Prudence Ardmore was from St. Louis, she told him. He asked how she knew, because Prudence had told her on the coach into Ironwood Falls. There had been a woman in the seat behind Elspeth who had known her. She had said Prudence had come west in the 60s, from St. Louis, alone, with a boy. A boy, Jed echoed. A boy. The two of them looked at each other in the doorway of a dead man's bedroom. Oh God, Jed said very softly, because Prudence Ardmore was not just a woman who had come west and made her fortune and grown cruel. Prudence Ardmore was if the arithmetic held the woman Silas Harrogate had left behind, and the boy she had brought west, the boy she had brought west was somewhere. The boy she had brought west was. Elspeth pressed her hand to her mouth. She whispered his name, Callum. Jed's face did not move, but behind his eyes something Elspeth did not have a name for was closing like a shutter. Callum had been born in 1858, he told her. His father had brought Callum up here in the summer of '59. He had said the mother had died in childbirth. He had raised Callum alongside them. He had never spoken of the woman again. He lied, Elspeth said. He lied. Or he had thought she was dead, and she hadn't been. Jed said her name. Yes. If she was who they thought she was. Yes. Then Prudence Ardmore had spent 30 years watching a boy who was hers being raised in another woman's house by the man who had abandoned her, and she had in the end killed him to take the mountain back from all of them. Elspeth's knees gave out. She sat down on the edge of the bed, because if that was true, then Callum had died at the hand of the woman who had borne him, because that was a species of evil she had read about only in the Old Testament, and even there it had made her close the book. She looked up. They had to find Dee. Tonight, whoever she was their witness, and she was running out of time. Jed nodded once. He turned. He walked to the top of the stairs. He called down into the house in the voice Elspeth was beginning to recognize as the voice he used when the household was going to war. Ezra, Finn, saddle 3 horses. They were riding to Ironwood Falls. From below, Ezra's voice came back dry and low, in the dark. Then Ezra called back a question that was really a statement. Ardmore House. Jed did not repeat it. He didn't need to. There was a pause. Then Ezra, deeper and quieter than before, made the only additional comment he intended to make about any of it. About time. They rode down the mountain at midnight. The moon was 3/4 full, and the snow reflected it, and the trail was silver white beneath the horses' hooves, and Elspeth rode Millie in the middle of the 3 brothers, with the leather portfolio strapped inside her coat and Callum's journal in her saddlebag. Nobody spoke. The mountain did not want speech. The mountain wanted them silent and swift and certain, and they were all 3. They reached the outskirts of Ironwood Falls at 3 in the morning. The town was asleep. Only one house at the end of Main Street had a light burning in an upstairs window, the Ardmore house. Jed pulled up his gray gelding. He turned in the saddle and assigned positions. Ezra would watch the back. Finn would watch the front. Nobody in, nobody out. Elspeth and Jed would go through the kitchen door. Ezra asked dryly, with what warrant? Jed replied with none. Good, Ezra murmured, and then said nothing more. They tied the horses at the edge of the woods behind the property. They crossed the frozen kitchen garden on foot. Jed tried the kitchen door. It was locked. He looked at Elspeth. She looked at him. Break it, she told him. He broke it. He put his shoulder to the door, and the frame gave with a soft crack that sounded in the silent, snow-covered yard like the report of a distant rifle. He caught the door before it could slam against the wall. He held it open. He looked at Elspeth once. She stepped through. The kitchen was dark. The house was warm. Somewhere upstairs a floorboard creaked. Elspeth held her breath. Jed drew a knife from his belt, not to threaten, to be ready. They moved through the kitchen down a hallway, floored in real hardwood, past a parlor with velvet chairs and a piano and a portrait of a young Prudence Ardmore in a green silk gown, past a closed door with a brass key still in the lock to a staircase carpeted in Turkish red. Elspeth put her hand on the banister. She climbed. The upstairs landing had 4 doors. 3 were dark. The 4th showed a thin bar of yellow lamplight underneath it, and from behind that door came the sound of a woman coughing. Elspeth crossed the landing. She put her ear against the wood. The coughing continued for a long moment. Then it stopped. Then a voice, hoarse and thin and unmistakably young, asked who was there. Elspeth looked at Jed. Jed nodded. She turned the knob. The room was small and clean and beautifully furnished, and it was clearly a prison. The window was nailed shut with fresh boards. The door had no lock on the inside. The lamp burned low on a bedside table, and in the bed, propped up against 3 pillows, was a woman of perhaps 28, with dark hair spread across the linen, and cheeks the wrong color, and eyes that were at that moment enormous with fear. Then the eyes recognized Elspeth's face. Then the eyes recognized Jed's face behind her. Then the woman in the bed began to cry. She said one word, only one. Finally. Her name was Delphine. She told them, between coughs and swallows of the water Elspeth held to her lips, 29 years old. She was, she said, Prudence Ardmore's daughter. She was, she said, Silas Harrowgate's daughter. Callum had been her older brother, and she had not known him. Not once. Not ever. Prudence had kept them apart for 30 years, and Delphine had grown up in a St. Louis boarding house, believing her father had died in a mining accident, and her mother had done her best. Delphine had come to Montana Territory that spring. Consumption. She had thought it would be a rest cure. She had thought her mother would be kind at last. She had, she said, been wrong. Elspeth sat on the edge of the bed. She held Delphine's hand. Jed stood at the door with the knife still in his good hand, and his face was carved out of grief and fury in equal measure, and Elspeth did not look at him because she was afraid of what her face would do if she did. Delphine spoke slowly, gathering her breath between phrases. Callum had come to see her in April when he had found out about her. He had come to the back of the house at night. He had said they were brother and sister. He had said he had known nothing until 3 weeks before, when Vesper Sable had told him she had heard a rumor from a washerwoman. He had said he wanted her to come up the mountain and meet Jed and Ezra and Finn. He had said, she coughed. Elspeth held the cup. I had said he was going to bring her home. On the 15th of May, he was going to come down and get her. He had said not to tell her mother because he did not trust her, and he did not know why yet. Delphine's eyes filled. He never came. He couldn't come, Elspeth told her gently. He was killed on the 11th. Delphine already knew. By Elspeth asked. By her. The single syllable dropped into the room like a stone into a well. Delphine turned her face toward Jed. Mr. Harrowgate, she began. She had been in this house for 6 months. She had heard her mother through this wall, planning what she would do. She had hired a man from Butte. She had paid a marshal in Ironwood Falls $300. She had forged papers on their mountain and on 3 other properties, and when she was done with their family, when the last of them was off that ridge, she meant to open the silver seam under Whisper Ridge, and she meant to be the richest woman in Montana Territory, before she died. Jed did not speak. He could not. Delphine reached out with one thin hand. Mr. Harrogate, her brother. She had not known him, but she was going to help him finish what he had started, and if she died in the doing of it, that was well, because she had not had a family in 29 years, and Callum had meant to give her one. Elspeth was already moving. They were taking her out of here. Now. Tonight. Jed nodded. Wrap her warm. He would carry her down. Elspeth pointed out that he had one hand. Jed corrected her. He had two hands. One was only quieter than the other. He crossed to the bed. He wrapped Delphine in the quilt, then in a second quilt he pulled from a chest at the foot of the bed. He lifted her as though she weighed nothing, which she nearly did, and he carried her out of the room and down the staircase and through the ruined kitchen door. Elspeth followed with the lamp turned low. They did not wake the household, because there was Delphine had told them no household to wake. Prudence had gone to Butte 3 days ago to meet the hired man. She had left Delphine locked in the room with a maid to check on her twice a day. The maid slept in the servants' cottage across the yard. The maid Delphine said was afraid of Prudence, but not cruel. They crossed the garden. They reached the horses. Ezra saw Jed's face and did not ask. Finn saw the bundle in Jed's arms and did ask. Who? Their sister Jed told him. Finn's mouth opened. He did not close it for a long time. They rode for the mountain. The moon was setting when they reached the house. Vesper was on the porch. She had Elspeth suspected not slept. She saw Jed dismount with the bundle in his arms, and she came down the steps at a run, and she took one look at Delphine's face, and she was already assigning tasks. She needed the fire made up, broth from the stove, clean linens from the top shelf of the linen press, more wood, and someone watching the road. Everyone moved, because when Vesper Sable spoke like that, everyone moved. They laid Delphine on the settee by the fire. Vesper spooned broth between her cracked lips. Elspeth sat on the floor beside her and held her hand and watched the color come back very slowly into a face that had spent 6 months in a locked room. Jed stood by the fire. He did not sit. He was looking at his half-sister as though he was memorizing her, as though he was afraid to blink in case she was gone when he opened his eyes. After a long while, Delphine slept, not the sleep of the dying, the sleep of a woman who had been carrying a stone for 6 months and had at last set it down. Vesper covered her with a blanket. She looked up at Jed. She said one word, Silas. Jed nodded once. Vesper touched Delphine's dark hair very briefly. She told him his father had been a good man in most things and a fool in one, but God had a way of stitching things back together, even the tears the fool made. She went back to the kitchen. Jed looked at Elspeth. Elspeth looked at Jed. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them needed to. The judge came sooner than anyone expected. Elspeth had written the letter on the 5th morning after they brought Delphine home. She had written it to the offices of the Montana Territorial Herald in Helena, and she had enclosed a copy of Obadiah Finch's statement, and she had described in careful, unhysterical prose the situation on Whisper Ridge and in Ironwood Falls, and she had named names, and she had signed her own. She had written the letter to Helena herself, with Finn, because Jed would not leave the mountain while Delphine was in the house, and Ezra would not leave the mountain while any Harrogate remained on it. The letter had reached the Herald on a Tuesday. The Herald had run a front-page item on the Friday. The item had been read that Saturday in the parlor of the circuit judge of the Montana Territory, a man named Elias Pennington, who had been thinking of retiring and who read the item twice and then put down his newspaper and told his wife to cancel their Christmas visit to her sister. He had work. Judge Pennington arrived in Ironwood Falls 3 weeks earlier than his scheduled circuit. He convened court in the meeting hall on the second Monday of January 1885. The hall was full. Elspeth stood at the front of the room in her navy blue traveling dress, cleaned and pressed her honey blonde hair pinned high. Delphine sat in the front row, wrapped in a shawl Vesper had knitted her upright and pale and beautiful, and her presence in that room had already, before a single word had been spoken, done half the work Elspeth had brought her to do, because half the town had never seen Prudence Ardmore's niece. Half the town had believed the niece was a fiction. Half the town was now looking at a young woman with the pale eyes of Silas Harrogate and the dark hair of Prudence Ardmore, and half the town was doing arithmetic they had not previously done. Jed sat behind Elspeth, Ezra beside him, Finn beside Ezra. Obadiah Finch, who had made the journey from Helena at 71 years of age in the middle of January, and who had told Elspeth on arrival that God did not permit him to die, yet sat in the second row with his neighbor Josiah beside him. The Riversons were there. They had, when Elspeth had knocked on their door 2 weeks before, with Delphine in the wagon behind her, opened the door for the first time in 6 years to a stranger. They had listened. They had cried. They had brought out a wooden box they had kept buried behind their smokehouse, and inside the box had been a forged letter from Prudence Ardmore, dated 1881, and beneath that letter had been Obadiah Finch's original signed statement from 1878, which they had kept and not burned because Mrs. Riverson had told Elspeth on the porch of her own house that she had never quite been able to strike the last match. The Abbotts had not been findable, but the Wesley widow had. She had come from Iowa on a train. She had come because Elspeth had written to her, and Elspeth had written the truth, and Mrs. Wesley had put her children in her sister's keeping and boarded a train east to west with her husband's original loan document sewn into the lining of her coat. She sat now in the second row. Her face was carved granite. The judge banged his gavel. Prudence Ardmore entered the courtroom. Elspeth had not seen her in the flesh before that morning. She was smaller than Elspeth expected, elegant, composed, 60 years old, and beautifully dressed in a black wool suit that had come at great expense from Chicago. Her white hair was arranged in a coronet of braids. Her hands, small and white and folded before her, wore 3 rings. She walked to the front of the courtroom on the arm of her lawyer, and she did not at any point look at Delphine, which was, Elspeth understood, its own confession. The lawyer, a sharp-faced man named Aldrich from Butte, opened for the defense. He spoke smoothly. He spoke of the Harrogate family's long-standing debt. He spoke of Mrs. Ardmore's patient generosity in holding the note. He spoke of the unfortunate circumstances that had led to Mr. Jedediah Harrogate's understandable delay in payment. He did not speak of the acceleration clause. He did not speak of the interest rate. He did not speak of Callum Harrogate at all. Then Elspeth stood. She had asked the judge, in a letter delivered by Finn the night before, for permission to present the plaintiff's case on behalf of the Harrogate family and the other affected families of Silver Creek Valley, as she was the party who had gathered the evidence. Judge Pennington, in a note delivered back to her before dawn, had written a single line, "Miss Fairweather, I would not miss it for a great deal of money." She stepped forward now. She was wearing a woman's dress, but she carried herself with the composure of a barrister. She laid the original Harrogate note on the judge's bench. She laid Prudence Ardmore's demand letter beside it. She laid Obadiah Finch's signed statement beside both. She laid the Riverson documents. She laid the Wesley documents. She spoke for 18 minutes. She did not raise her voice once. She named the forged interest rates. She named the fabricated acceleration clauses. She named the 4 families. She named the dead man in the Wesley barn. Then she called Obadiah Finch to the stand. He came slowly. He was sworn in. He looked at Prudence Ardmore across the room, and he did not blink, and he testified for 40 minutes in a voice that had not lost its precision in 6 years of retirement. And when he was finished, the room was so still that Elspeth could hear the fire in the stove at the back of the hall. She called Mrs. Wesley. Mrs. Wesley's testimony was 17 minutes long. Half the women in the courtroom were weeping when she finished. Then Elspeth turned toward the front row. Softly she asked Delphine whether she was able. Delphine stood. She was very pale, but she was upright, and when she crossed the room to the witness stand, she did not look at Prudence Ardmore, and Prudence Ardmore, for the first time that morning, looked at her. Prudence's face did something. It did not move visibly, but something inside her face broke in the way a plate breaks under a tablecloth, silently, invisibly, but permanently. Delphine sat down in the witness chair. She placed her hand on the Bible. She swore to tell the truth. She looked at the judge. Her name, she said, was Delphine Louise Harrogate. She had been born in St. Louis on the 7th of March, 1855. Her mother was the woman sitting at that table. Her father had been Silas Nathaniel Harrogate of Whisper Ridge, Montana Territory. Callum Harrogate had been her older brother. She had never met him. Her mother had had him killed by a man named Barrow from Butte in May of last year. She had done it because he had come to see Delphine. She had done it because he had been going to bring her home, and she had kept Delphine in a locked room in her house for 6 months so that she could not tell anyone. The hall did not breathe. Delphine's testimony was 41 minutes long. She named the man Barrow. She named the amounts. She described a conversation she had overheard through the wall of her locked bedroom on the night of May 10th, in which her mother had said in Delphine's own hearing that Callum would be on the north slope tomorrow. The tree fell at noon. She wept. Once. Only once. Then she straightened and she looked at Prudence Ardmore across the courtroom, and she addressed her one final time. Mama. She had loved her mother until she had understood her, and she was telling this because it was the truth, and because Callum had deserved better, and because whatever her mother did to her now could not be worse than what had already been done. Prudence Ardmore did not move, but her lawyer stood up. He requested a recess. His client was unwell. The judge looked at Aldrich. Judge Pennington was not a large man, but at that moment he looked like a mountain. "Sit down, counselor," he told him. Aldrich sat down. Then, and this was the moment Elspeth would remember for the rest of her life, the courtroom door at the back of the hall opened, and Marshal Beau Hanley of Ironwood Falls stepped into the aisle, and he removed his hat. He walked to the front of the room. He did not wait to be called. He asked the judge's pardon. He needed to be heard. Judge Pennington acknowledged him. Hanley was the marshal of this town. He had jurisdiction to speak. Speak. Marshal Hanley turned to face the room. His face was gray. His hands at his sides were shaking, and Elspeth realized after a second that he was not shaking with fear. He was shaking with the specific tremor of a man who had crossed at last a line inside himself that he had been walking along for years. 6 months ago, he told the room, Mrs. Ardmore had paid him $300 to sign a statement saying he had witnessed Jedediah Harrogate threatening his brother Callum on the north slope of Whisper Ridge on the evening of May 10th, 1884. He had not witnessed any such thing. Jedediah Harrogate had not been on the north slope that evening. He had been at his own kitchen table with his brothers and Mrs. Sable. He had taken the money because his wife was sick, and the doctor and Helena had wanted $20 he did not have. His wife had died anyway. He had carried that statement in his desk drawer for 6 months. He had not yet used it, but he had been going to, and he would like now to enter it into evidence as a false document, and he would like to be arrested, and he would like this town to know that he was not what it had thought he was. I walked to the judge's bench. He drew a folded paper from his coat. He laid it in front of Judge Pennington. He unpinned his star from his shirt. He laid the star on top of the paper. He stepped back. He was ready, he told the judge. The silence in the room lasted perhaps 10 seconds. It felt like an hour. Then Judge Elias Pennington picked up the star. He picked up the folded false statement. He looked at Marshall Hanley for a long moment, and Elspeth watched something pass between the two men that she did not entirely understand. Then the judge quietly informed Hanley that he would surrender himself to the custody of the court at the close of these proceedings, and he would answer for the taking of the bribe. But the court would note when his case was heard that he had come forward of his own accord. "Sit down, sir." Hanley sat down. The judge turned to Prudence Ardmore and instructed her to stand. She stood. He read the charges: fraud, forgery, bribery of a public official, conspiracy to commit murder, conspiracy to obstruct justice, unlawful confinement of a person. She would be held in the county jail at Helena pending trial. Bail was denied. Prudence Ardmore did not speak. She did not look at Delphine. She did not look at Jed. She looked for one long moment out the window at the snow. Then she allowed the deputy to take her arm, and she walked out of the courtroom, and Elspeth Fairweather watched the woman who had killed Callum Harrogate walk out of Ironwood Falls in the custody of the law, and Elspeth felt at last the thing she had been holding since November, not triumph, not joy, a slow, deep exhalation that seemed to go on and did not need to end. She turned around. Jed was standing. He was looking at her. His pale eyes were bright. Delphine was 3 months in the ground before Jed spoke of what happened next. She had not lasted the summer. The consumption had been too far along, and no amount of Vespers broth and Wisconsin honey and clean mountain air could pull it back. She had lived through the trial. She had lived through spring. She had lived to see the first purple crocuses come up along the south slope where the snow melted first, and she had asked Elspeth on the last clear morning of her life to bury her on that slope beside the brother she had never met. They had done it. Ezra had dug the grave himself. Finn had built the marker. Jed had spoken the words, and Elspeth Fairweather had stood at the edge of a mountain grave in June of 1885 with her hand in Jed Harrogate's damaged hand, and she had watched Delphine Louise Harrogate laid to rest beside Callum Michael Harrogate, and she had thought for the first time since her mother had died that some family in this world was worth every ounce of pain it cost you to have it. Summer worked itself through the mountain in its usual patient rhythm. The days lengthened. The hay came in. Ezra rebuilt the smokehouse from the ground up, and Finn helped him, and Jed came down off the roof one afternoon in July with a slight limp that he refused to explain. and a jar of wild honey that Elspeth found on her pillow that night with no note. She kept the jar for a long time. She did not eat any of it. The August garden was heavy that year. The peas had come in thick, and the beans and the tomatoes Vesper had insisted on trying from seeds a peddler had sold her in April, and Elspeth was gathering the last of the pea pods into a basket over her arm when Jed came around the side of the house. She saw him coming. She did not stop what she was doing. She had learned over 8 months of living in his house that Jed Harrogate had things to say to her on his own schedule, and that pushing him produced silence and waiting produced everything. He stopped at the edge of the garden. He did not step in, because the garden was hers. He spoke her name, she spoke his. He wanted to ask her something. All right, she told him. She kept picking peas. Her heart was doing something ridiculous inside her chest, but her hands were steady because her hands at this point in her life could be counted on to be steady when nothing else was. Jed cleared his throat. I didn't have a ring, he began. There wasn't a ring in this house, and he hadn't been to Helena to buy one because he had wanted to ask her first before he did anything that would make her feel she had to say yes, because he had spent the money and he didn't have the words some men would have. He had never been much for words, and he was 40 years old and his hands still didn't straighten, and he had 2 grown brothers and a housekeeper and a mountain that would take work from all of them every day for the rest of their lives, and he was not what any young woman in Philadelphia had thought she was going to marry. He paused. He looked at her. But if she would consider marrying him, Elspeth Fairweather, he would spend the rest of his life making sure that not one day passed where she regretted the answer, and he would spend the rest of his life making sure she never once felt like the mail-order bride who had come for one brother and got another. She would be his wife. She would be a Harrogate, and every good thing on this mountain, from the peas in that basket to the roof over that house, would be as much hers as his. Elspeth set the basket down. Very slowly, she wiped her hands on her apron. She crossed the garden. She stopped in front of him. She said his full name, Jedediah Harrogate. Yes, she had been waiting 8 months for him to ask her that question. I know, he told her. She caught it. He knew. She had hands that didn't work right, he pointed out, but he didn't have ears that didn't work right too. She laughed. It burst out of her unbidden right there in the vegetable garden, and Jed Harrogate smiled for the first time she had seen him smile fully. The smile Finn had told her about back in December on the platform, the one that had not appeared on his face since Callum, and it changed him. It changed him entirely. He looked for a moment like the young man he must once have been before the bear and before Meredith and before Callum, and Elspeth Fairweather reached up with both her hands and took his face between them. Yes, Jed. She spoke his shorter name softly, and she said it again. Yes. He kissed her, just once, very carefully, like a man who had been given permission to touch something he had thought he would never be allowed near. Then he took her hand, his good one, and he led her out of the garden and around to the front of the house where Vesper Sable was standing on the porch pretending to shell beans and clearly obviously watching, and where Finn was pretending to mend a bridle and clearly obviously watching, and where Ezra Harrogate was sitting on the top step whittling a piece of pine into what looked like it was going to be, in a week or so, a wooden ring, because Ezra had known. Ezra had known for months. Ezra had evidently decided that if his brother was going to marry a woman without a ring, Ezra Harrogate was going to fix that particular problem himself without being asked, in the way of mountain men everywhere. Elspeth looked at him. Ezra looked at Elspeth. Ezra grunted. Elspeth burst into tears again for the fourth time in her entire time at Whisper Ridge, and Vesper Sable came down the porch steps and put her arms around her and welcomed her home. They married in October. The pastor came up the mountain. Half the valley came with him. The Riversons brought a wedding quilt they had been sewing since June. Mrs. Wesley, back from Iowa with her 3 children to attend, brought a copy of Obadiah Finch's original 1878 note framed as a wedding gift, which Elspeth cried over and then hung in the front hall where every guest could see it and understand. Obadiah Finch himself came from Helena. He was 72 now. He gave Elspeth away because her father had been gone 22 years, and because Obadiah Finch had in a certain sense given her something almost as important, and because Elspeth had asked him, and because he had wept for 1 full minute in his own kitchen when she asked, and then told her yes. The ceremony was held on the south slope, beside the 2 graves, because Callum belonged there, because Delphine belonged there, because a wedding without them, Elspeth had said, would be a wedding missing 2 of its most important guests. Vesper Sable stood in Elspeth's place as mother of the bride. Ezra stood beside Jed as best man. Finn stood beside Elspeth as her best man because she had asked him, and because he had promised her back on the porch on the morning after Jed had proposed that he had made her a vow in December to bring her back to this mountain, and he aimed to see the job through. They wrote their own vows. Elspeth's were short. She told him she had come up this mountain a stranger. He had made her a Harrogate. She would love him all the days she had. Jed's were shorter. He told her she was the first hand he had ever held that had not flinched. He would love her until his last. The pastor pronounced them. The mountain was silent for one long moment. Then from the top of the ridge a hawk called, and it was Ezra who noticed, and it was Ezra who leaned toward the 2 of them and murmured quietly enough that only Elspeth and Jed heard him that Callum knew. 5 years passed. The mountain kept its rhythm. There was hay in the summer and elk in the fall, and the deep snow in December, and the calves in March, and the peas in August, and the small fine sorrows, and the small fine joys that made up the actual texture of a marriage, of a family, of a life. Ezra Harrogate married Ruth Riverson in the spring of 1887. She was the middle Riverson daughter, and she had, Ezra told Elspeth quietly on the day of the wedding, been the reason he had begun making excuses to ride into Ironwood Falls in the winter of 1886. Finn did not marry, not yet. He told anyone who asked, still deciding. But Finn had built in the spring of 1888 a small building at the north end of the yard, and he had filled it with books, and he had opened it to the valley on Sundays, and it had become, without any of them planning it, the first free library between Ironwood Falls and Helena. He had above the door carved a single word, Delphine's. Elspeth had wept when she saw it. She had wept for a long time. Then she had gone inside, and she had brought out Callum's leather-bound journal, and she had placed it on the first shelf alongside a small handwritten card that read, in memory of Callum Michael Harrogate. His words made this place possible. The silver seam under Whisper Ridge was surveyed by a licensed engineer in 1888. It was real. It was substantial. But it was, Jed told them in a family meeting one evening at the trestle table, not the kind of wealth they wanted, because Prudence Ardmore had killed for that silver, because Callum had died in its shadow, because the mountain had spent 100 million years making it, and the Harrogates had spent 150 years learning how to live on the surface without tearing it open. They sealed the seam. They did not tell the valley they had done it. They kept the mountain as the mountain was, and they lived all of them on hay and elk and calves and peas, and they were by every measure Elspeth Fairweather Harrogate had ever cared about rich. On a January morning in 1890, with the snow heavy on the mountain and two small children asleep upstairs in what had once been Callum's room and was now the nursery, Jed Harrogate came in from the early feeding and found Elspeth at Callum's old desk writing. He stood in the doorway. He watched her. He asked what she was writing. She turned. She smiled at him. A letter, she told him. To who? To a girl she didn't know yet. He raised an eyebrow. There was a mail-order bride agency in Chicago, she explained. She had written to them last month. She had told them she would like to be considered as a correspondent for young women who were considering the journey west, to answer their questions honestly, to tell them what they were and were not likely to find. She paused. She looked at him. She would have wanted such a letter, she said quietly, in Philadelphia, in November of 1884, before she got on that coach. Jed crossed the room slowly. He came to stand behind her chair. He placed his damaged hand on her shoulder. Warm, steady, home. He asked what she was telling this girl she didn't know yet. Elspeth looked down at the page she had just finished. She read aloud what she had written. My dear friend, whoever you are not what your city thinks you are, and you are not what the man in the advertisement thinks you are, and you are not what the woman at the agency thinks you are. You are the person who will step off the stage at the end of the line. You are the person who will look up at whoever is standing on that platform, and you are the person who will decide in the first minute whether the life ahead of you is one worth staying for. I stayed. I would tell you to stay only if the man on that platform is worth staying for, and I would tell you that you will know, because a man who is worth staying for will make your bed with his own hands before you arrive. He will hand you a blanket without being asked. He will believe you when you tell him a paper is a forgery, and he will show you his damaged hand and let you decide whether you can love it. And if the man on that platform does not do these things, my friend, you will have my letter in your reticule. Turn around, go home, or come to Whisper Ridge, Montana territory. There is always a room here for a woman who has traveled a long way to find one. I am always your sister in the West, Elspeth Fairweather Harrogate. She looked up. Jed's eyes were very bright. He did not speak. He did not need to. He bent his head down and he pressed a kiss to the top of her honey blonde hair, and he stood there for a long moment with his damaged hand on her shoulder and his good hand curled around the back of her chair and outside the window on the shoulder of a mountain called Whisper Ridge. The January wind moved through the pines and made the sound the mountain had made for 10,000 years before them and would make for 10,000 years after. A whisper, just beneath human hearing. But if you were quiet and if you listened and if you had earned the right, you could hear what it was saying. It was saying stay. It was saying